Roy stood at the edge of his driveway, watching the heavy rain stream down in relentless sheets. He felt a tumultuous mix of frustration and disbelief, replaying the events of the afternoon in his mind. Here he was, an upstanding homeowner with dreams of creating the perfect office space, now grappling with a neighbor who seemed to delight in disrupting his tranquility at every turn. Max had moved in next door like a whirlwind, and somehow, he'd commandeered control of the neighborhood without anyone noticing. First came the letters about his succulent garden, then the noise about his trash cans, and now this, his car parked in Roy's carport, without so much as a by your leave. The audacity of it all churned in his stomach. Most outrageous was Max's casual excuse about the rain, as if the downpour allowed him to do as he pleased on Roy's property. After their encounter, Roy felt he'd reached a breaking point. He could no longer let Max's boundaryless antics slide under the radar. His thoughts were churning with ideas on how to handle him without blowing everything out of proportion. He had tried being diplomatic, but clearly, reasonable communication had failed. What other options did he have? Feeling a surge of resolve, he returned inside his house and sat at his desk, the dim light flickering above him. He drafted an email to his friend who owned a towing company, detailing recent events and requesting a favor. Perhaps a little taste of his own medicine is what he needs, he mused, biting his lip to suppress a smirk that threatened to escape his face. The idea felt risky but oddly satisfying. After a few exchanges, Roy confirmed that a truck would arrive later that evening. He felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. What if Max somehow found out? What if it backfired? But the thought of Max casually invading his space, just like he had with his parking shenanigans and the trespass into his garage, made Roy double down on the decision. As night fell, the sound of rain transitioned from a drizzle to a gentle patter, almost soothing in contrast to his racing thoughts. The plan was set. When the tow truck arrived, Roy would let his friend handle the logistics while he kept watch from a distance. He felt a rush of adrenaline coursing through him, as if he were part of a movie where the underdog finally fights back against an overzealous antagonist. With a few swift motions, Max's car was hooked up and loaded onto the truck. Roy stifled a laugh at how easy it appeared. This was too good to be true. Just as the truck was about to pull away, the lights from a second vehicle flickered on, illuminating the scene. It was Max. He had come home unexpectedly, perhaps worried about his car in the storm. Roy's heart raced. He hadn't anticipated his return at this hour. Bracing himself, he stepped out from behind the fence, deciding to face Max head-on rather than retreat. What he didn't expect was the sheer fury painted across Max's face. "What do you think you're doing?" he exclaimed, his voice slicing through the rain-fueled silence. Roy held his ground. "I'm reclaiming my property, Maximum. You can't just park your car in my garage without permission. You've invaded my space too many times." Max's expression shifted from shock to indignation. "You're taking it too far. You can't just remove someone's car like that." At that moment, time seemed to stand still, the air thick with tension. Roy felt a thrill. He had finally pushed back against the entitled behavior he had endured for far too long. "This isn't about taking it too far," he asserted. "It's about respect and boundaries. You've crossed them multiple times." Max's eyes narrowed, his tone dripping with sarcasm as he retorted, "Respect? You've sold my car for scrap. You'll regret this. This is theft." "I didn't sell it," Roy shot back, feigning a calm demeanor despite the adrenaline racing through him. "I had it towed. But considering it was parked illegally, maybe it's just a lesson on what trespassing feels like." Max's demeanor shifted from assertive to desperate. "You can't do this to me. I'll make sure the HOA gets involved. You'll pay for this." Roy shook his head, a smack tugging at his lips, as he felt a surge of victory. "Go ahead. I have all the evidence I need to prove you're trespassing." The tow truck rolled away, leaving Roy standing there with a fierce sense of empowerment. Little did he know, the conflict was far from over. As he turned to head back inside, he noticed Max's husband approaching from down the street, his body language radiating aggression. "Where's my husband's car?" he bellowed, jaw clenched and fists balled up at his sides. Roy inhaled deeply, preparing for the confrontation that was now inevitable. He had stood his ground against one wave. Now, He had to face another. The storm was far from over, and he was ready to weather it. But to what extent would their entitlement push them? He had ignited the fire. Now it was time to see just how fierce it would burn. Roy inhaled deeply, preparing for the confrontation that was now inevitable. He had stood his ground against one wave. Now, he had to face another. The storm was far from over, and he was ready to weather it. But to what extent would Max and his husband's entitlement push them? He had ignited the fire. Now it was time to see just how fierce it would burn. The confrontation unfolded as Max's husband stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "You think you can just take someone else's property? You think this is some game?" The anger in his voice crackled through the air like lightning. "I didn't take anything," Roy replied, trying to maintain his composure despite the tension. "I had your car towed because it was parked illegally in my garage. I warned Max multiple times not to trespass on my property." "Warned? Is that what you call it? This is absurd. You can't just play God with other people's things," he snapped, clenching his fists tightly, as if preparing for a fight. Roy stood his ground, a wave of determination washing over him. "What's absurd is ignoring boundaries. Max has repeatedly parked in my garage without asking, and I'm done allowing that to happen. You need to understand that I have a right to my property." Max's husband narrowed his eyes, frustration radiating from every corner of his being. "You think you can get away with this? I'll make sure everyone knows how you treated us. You villainizing my husband over a stupid misunderstanding." The atmosphere around them hummed with tension, almost like the calm before a storm. "A misunderstanding," Roy replied sharply, his voice steady yet filled with conviction. "If you consider trespassing a misunderstanding, then what about respecting others' rights? How far are you willing to go to defend this behavior?" Just then, a flicker of doubt crossed Max's husband's face. Perhaps the reality of their situation finally sank in. Deep down, he might have known that their acts of entitlement had gone too far. But rather than backing down, he let his anger fuel him further. "You don't want to play this game with me. You have no idea who you're messing with." Roy shrugged, a calm facade masking the adrenaline racing through him. "I'm not afraid of you. All I want is to be left alone in my own home. You might think intimidation works, but it'll only make things worse for you." His standoff hung in the air, electric, thundering like the storm that loomed above them. But before either could speak again, a familiar figure emerged in the door of Roy's house. It was his friend from the towing company, who had been watching quietly from the shadows, gauging the situation. "Everything all right?" he asked, stepping forward. The presence of a calm third party dissipated some of the pent-up tension, but Max's husband glanced back at Roy with a mixture of contempt and wariness. "Yeah, just a little disagreement," Roy replied, his tone lighter as he gestured toward the tow truck parked at the curb. His friend looked between them, sensing the animosity in the air. "Listen, if you have a problem that needs resolving, I can help," his friend said, attempting to defuse the situation while positioning himself to support Roy. Max's husband wasn't finished, though. "Oh, it's the best friend. You want to back him up in bullying my husband? How pathetic. Let's see if you're still so brave when I make a few calls." "What calls?" Roy shot back, now emboldened. "To the HOA? You think they are going to side with someone who tramples on other people's rights?" An uncomfortable silence enveloped the street, only broken by the distant rumble of thunder. Then, Max's husband stepped back, his bravado faltering slightly. "You're underestimating us," he warned. "This isn't over." And with that, he turned, his frustration palpable, retreating back towards their house. Roy watched them go, a mix of relief and lingering tension settling within him. The immediate confrontation had ended, but the storm, both literal and metaphorical, was far from over. After Roy closed his door, he sank into his chair, heart racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before an inevitable storm of retaliatory actions from Max and his husband. He felt confident in the evidence he had amassed, but as he looked around at the calmness in his living room, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Would Max retaliate? Would the HOA truly be on his side? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he knew one thing for sure. He needed to stay prepared. Roy spent the next few days strategizing. He gathered every letter, every note, and every piece of evidence he could find. He cut a few videos from his security footage, detailing each encounter with Max that had led to this breaking point. All of it neatly organized in a folder labeled proof. He also reached out to a lawyer, seeking advice on how to counter any possible backlash, knowing that Max was likely not done with him. Despite his frustration with the whole situation, Roy felt empowered. He was no longer the victim. As a plan began to form, he couldn't help but feel that he was finally turning the tables. Just as he was getting lost in thoughts about legal defenses and neighborhood alliances, an email from the HOA arrived in his inbox, titled, "Community Meeting Alert." His heart raced. This could be the moment where everything played out. This was where he would finally make a stand, and he wasn't about to back down. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, focusing on neighborhood conduct and community standards. As he read the email, a sense of purpose filled him. It was time to fight back, to stand up not just for himself but for all the homeowners in the neighborhood who might have been silenced by Max's bullying. With every passing moment, Roy found his resolve strengthening. He marked his calendar with a bold red circle around the date of the meeting. The stage was set. It was time to declare that enough was enough. Not just for him, but for any other neighbor who might face a similar challenge. As he sat at his desk that night, organizing everything, his mind raced with possibilities. He was ready to present his case, ready to confront the HOA, and ready to make sure that Max understood his behavior would no longer go unchecked. The roller coaster of emotions only fueled his determination. With determination coursing through him, he drifted off to sleep, hoping that the storm that was brewing outside would wash away the countdown to the impending showdown. With determination coursing through him, Roy drifted off to sleep, hoping that the storm brewing outside would wash away the countdown to the impending showdown. The restless raindrops tapping sporadically against his window mirrored the uncertainty weaving through his mind. As dawn broke, the storm clouds hung heavy in the sky, foreshadowing the tumult of emotions that awaited him. Over the coming days, Roy meticulously organized his thoughts and collected documentation, transforming his experiences with Max into a cohesive narrative that he could present at the HOA meeting. He practiced what he would say, honing his arguments until they flowed like a well-rehearsed script. Each articulation of his plight built his confidence. He felt armed with facts and testimonials from neighbors who had experienced similar frustrations, all inspired to join his cause. The morning of the meeting arrived with a heavy gray blanket covering the sky, almost as if nature itself were echoing his foreboding feelings. He donned his best shirt, a crisp, buttoned-up ensemble that translated into professionalism and showcased his resolve. As Roy stepped out of his home, he felt the cool air envelop him like armor, both refreshing and invigorating. Residents gathered at the community center, their voices mingling in the air like the static before a storm. As Roy entered, he could sense the energy of the room shifting. Max was already there, leaning casually against the back wall, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he caught Roy's eye. It was as if he relished the expectation of a confrontation, like a cat toying with a mouse before the final pounce. Roy felt a rush of adrenaline as he mingled with the crowd, exchanging nods and murmurs of support. "I heard you going to speak up about Max," someone whispered. "We're behind you." Their support bolstered his confidence, solidifying his belief that this wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the entire community. As the meeting commenced, the atmosphere shifted. The HOA president called the meeting to order and began with announcements, but soon they transitioned to the agenda item that had everyone on edge: neighborhood conduct and community standards. Roy sifted through his notes, feeling like a tightrope walker balancing on the edge of a precipice. The president opened up the floor for residents to voice their concerns. One by one, neighbors spoke up, sharing their frustrations. As Max sat at the back, the smugness in his expression diminished as he listened to complaints about noise levels, trash violations, and boundaries being crossed. Finally, Roy's turn arrived. Heart pounding, he stepped forward, clutching his folder tightly against his chest. "Good evening, everyone. I'm here to address not just my personal grievances, but to amplify the voices of those who have felt similarly marginalized by our neighbor, Maximum." As he spoke, the room grew quieter, all eyes on him. Roy laid out the timeline of incidents, carefully detailing his encounters with Maximum. He presented the evidence he had collected, photos, notes, even testimony from other neighbors who stood in solidarity with him. The room began to murmur softly in agreement, and Roy's confidence surged. Home ownership in this community should come with respect for one another's property and peace of mind, he stated, his voice unwavering. None of us should have to worry about trespassing, illegal parking, or harassment. We need boundaries to foster a safe and harmonious neighborhood. Max interrupted, attempting to dismiss Roy's claims. This is all a fabrication. You're just trying to drag my name through the mud. His voice dripped with indignation, but Roy could sense the undercurrent of panic beneath it. Roy pressed on, unfazed. I have no intention of maligning anyone. I'm simply advocating for a respectful and harmonious living environment for all of us. He gestured toward Maximum. We've all seen the detrimental effects of behavior like this. I'm not the first, and I won't be the last, unless we commit to addressing it now. As he concluded, a wave of applause erupted from the crowd, immediately following by murmurs of agreement. Roy's heart swelled. He felt valued and supported. The HOA president raised a hand to quiet the room. Thank you, Roy. It's clear that this is an issue many feel strongly about. With renewed momentum, other residents began adding their voices, each information piling onto his narrative. They shared how Max's actions had disrupted their daily lives, painting a fuller picture of the toxic environment he had fostered. As Max's defenses crumbled, Roy began to notice the pressure shifting. The HOA president finally addressed Max directly. This has become a community concern. Without the respect and understanding we owe one another, we cannot thrive as a neighborhood. Rattled, Max leaped to his feet. This is nonsense. You all are acting like I'm some kind of villain. You'll regret this. The desperation in his voice echoed through the room, but Roy could see that the crowd was resolute. Regret. Roy counted, his voice steady. The only regret we should have is waiting this long to speak up. The room responded with renewed enthusiasm, anger at any notion of backing down. After the meeting, the conversations continued in hushed tones, but the line dividing the community became clear. Roy exchanged nods and words of encouragement with neighbors who approached him, grateful for his courage to speak out. It was a victory. Dawn was breaking on a new chapter for the neighborhood, the air electrified with the promise of change. But as he left the meeting with a mix of triumph and anxiety, he couldn't shake the feeling that Max wasn't the type to take this lightly. Days passed after the meeting, and Roy thought he had ushered in a new era of neighborhood respect. However, he soon noticed strange occurrences around his house, small signs of retaliation, unhinged mailboxes, mysteriously ransacked gardens, and even a few spiteful comments hurled his way by strangers. His victory felt tainted, and although he had rallied the support of the neighborhood, he braced himself for what could come next. Max was clever and calculating, and Roy sensed that the table had only turned momentarily. The fight was far from over, and he needed to steel himself for the inevitable response, one that would test not just his resolve, but also his sense of community. As the days turned into weeks, Roy decided to fortify his defenses both mentally and physically. He engaged with his neighbors more, organizing gatherings where they could bond and build more robust relationships. After all, a united front was their best shield against whatever storm Max was planning on unleashing. In the heart of this brewing conflict stood Roy, a man transformed by circumstances, now ready for the next chapter, ready to face what came next with the strength of his community behind him. The continuing saga was unfolding, and while the clouds still loomed overhead, he felt the first glimmers of sunlight breaking through. In the heart of the brewing conflict stood Roy, a man transformed by circumstances, now ready for the next chapter, prepared to face whatever storm Max was planning to unleash. The continuing saga was unfolding, and while the clouds still loomed ominously overhead, he felt the first glimmers of sunlight breaking through. Rallying the neighborhood became a source of newfound purpose for Roy. He organized weekly backyard BBQs and weekend block parties, gatherings that encouraged laughter and conversation, strengthening the bonds within the community. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves began to connect over shared grievances and aspirations for a peaceful living environment. Children played together while adults exchanged remedies for better lawn care and recipes for the best summer salads. But amid the laughter and camaraderie, Roy remained vigilant. The tension with Max hadn't dissipated. Instead, it seemed to simmer beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to boil over. Whenever an unmarked car parked on the street or shadow lingered near his property, Roy felt his pulse quicken. He could tell this was only the beginning of a war of attrition, and he had to stay prepared. One evening, as the sun set in hues of orange and pink, Roy received a call from his friend at the towing company. "I heard some rumors, buddy. Max is gathering intel and might be looking for loopholes to exploit against you," his friend warned. "Watch your back." An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of Roy's stomach. He had anticipated Max would retaliate, but knowing his actions could escalate to something more extreme was unsettling. Undeterred, however, he took it upon himself to further solidify friendships within the community, sharing his concerns and gathering support. They needed to stand united against Max and reinforce their collective boundaries. Then came the night of the next HOA meeting. Tension hung thick in the air as neighbors filed in, each person acutely aware that this meeting was not merely about community improvements, but a chance to confront Max's increasingly erratic behavior. Roy felt the urgency echoing in his chest. This was a critical moment. As conversations buzzed around him, Roy took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He noticed that Max was there too, trying to appear unbothered. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a smirk betraying his facade of nonchalance. Roy could see the simmering contempt bubbling beneath the surface. The meeting commenced, and the atmosphere intensified as complaints were raised regarding recent vandalism, property disputes, and growing unease in the neighborhood. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their experiences with Max's intrusive behavior. It was a chorus of frustrations, like thunder rolling in from the horizon. Roy stood at the front, heart pounding, when it was his turn to speak. "It's time we empower ourselves to reclaim our community from the chaos that Max has brought into our lives," he declared, his voice resonating through the room. "This is our home, and we deserve to feel safe and respected." As he continued to outline Max's transgressions and present the support he'd amassed, he could see things shifting. The moments of uncertainty began to coalesce into a single, unified voice, a force that couldn't be ignored. But just as Roy felt the momentum building, Max jumped to his feet, frustration etched on his face. "You are all overreacting. You think this is all about me? You're trying to witch hunt me to distract from your own shortcomings," he shouted, desperation leaking through each word. "Enough," the HOA president bellowed, cutting through the tension. "This is not the way to address concerns. What we need is unity and respect, not accusations." In a moment of reckoning, the president called for a vote to address Max's behaviors, something that not only clarified the concerns but also reinforced the boundaries that had previously been crossed. Roy's heart raced as he watched hands rise in unison, neighbors declaring their support for a motion aimed at establishing clearer guidelines for community conduct. The vote solidified. A resounding majority backed the motion. Max stood dumbfounded, seething with outrage, but the tide had turned. "You all will regret this," he hissed through clenched teeth as he retreated to the back of the room, fury emanating from him like heat waves from fire. The shadows of his irate threats seemed to loom large, but Roy felt a strange sense of empowerment flowing through him. The spirit of the community had ignited, and Max could no longer wield his entitlement unchecked. When the meeting adjourned, Roy was swarmed by neighbors, laughter mingling with expressions of relief. They celebrated the decision, feeling as though they had wrestled control from the brink of chaos. Yet, amid their joy, Roy remained acutely aware that the conflict was far from over. Afterward, as Roy walked home, he reflected on the evening's events. He knew that while a victory had been declared tonight, Max wouldn't disappear quietly into the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a blanket of stars across the sky, Roy steeled himself for whatever came next. Days turned into weeks, and tension hung like storm clouds over their community. Strange occurrences persisted. Mailboxes tipped over, unmarked cars casually lurking on the street, even late-night silhouettes lingering in shadows near homes. But the fences had been mended. Roy and his neighbors began looking out for one another more than ever before, further cultivating that sense of solidarity. Then one night, the inevitable confrontation arrived. As Roy returned home, he saw a figure lurking near his porch, a shadowy outline unmistakably recognizable. It was Max, rage written all over his features. "We're not done, Roy," he shouted. "You think you can just turn everyone against me and get away with it? You'll pay for this." Roy felt his pulse quicken, but he stood firm. "I'm not turning anyone against you, Maximum. You brought this on yourself." In that moment, the surroundings felt electric, the lingering storm overhead reflecting the chaos within. Yet it was different. Roy sensed a support forming behind him, neighbors appearing from their homes, rallying as one collective wall. "You don't belong here, Max," one of his neighbors shouted, stepping beside Roy, a united front. Soon, more voices joined in, creating a chorus of support, echoing the strength they had forged over the past few months. Max's bravado faltered as he realized the tide had turned against him. He surged forward, fists clenched, but it was too late. The community had converged, ready to stand firm against his aggression. "Leave us alone," another neighbor shouted. "We will not let you intimidate us any longer." The confrontation reached a boiling point as Max turned and stormed away, defeated. Roy glanced around at the faces beside him, the solidarity carrying him through the storm. As peace settled back into their community, Roy stood tall, heart racing but filled with a newfound sense of belonging. He realized that sometimes it takes facing the most daunting challenges to unite a community towards a greater purpose. They had transformed from a group of individuals into a powerful, harmonious force, ready to protect one another. Underneath the heavy dark clouds, the first hints of dawn peeked through, illuminating the strength forged in adversity. Their battle against one man and his attempts to sow discord had shaped them into something cohesive. In facing a common enemy, they had discovered friendship, camaraderie, and, more importantly, the power that resided within togetherness. Roy smiled, aware that while the immediate conflict with Max had seemingly resolved, life in their community would continue to change and adapt. With the spirit of unity kindled, he felt a deep sense of hope. The clouds had parted, and the dawn of a new day shone ahead. Together, they would weather any storm that dared to cross their path.